Hello, Dean Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September the 14th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. So let's jump right into our text. We've got 2 Samuel 10. We've got 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and Psalm 60 and 61. We've been in those two texts before, Psalm 60 and 61, and then in 2 Corinthians 3. So we might not spend as much time on those since we spent time on those previously in the year. Then we have another interesting text, as usual, from the book of Ezekiel and Ezekiel 17. So let's jump right on in. We've got, why don't we start with 2 Samuel 10, since I'm there in my text right now. So it's an interesting text. We've got the death of the king of the Ammonites died. This is Nahash, and when he dies, Hanun, his son, became king, and so David tries to reach out to them, sends envoys out of respect, but the Hanun suspects that David has an ulterior motive, and so they take the servants of David, and this is kind of humorous. They shave off half their beards and cut off their garments in the middle as far as their hips and sent them away. So this is quite the humiliation, isn't it? And then this, of course, is responded to by David. He hears of it, sends Joab and all the army and sons of men, and then the mighty men of David, and the Gibor Hayil of David, and then they go, and the sons of Ammon come out, and David ends up defeating them. This is where you see some of the language, by the way, like in verse 12, that we've seen throughout the historical books. Be strong and let us show ourselves courageous. Kind of reminds you of Joshua there. And then when they, of course, go out, David ends up defeating them. The Arameans fled before Israel. David killed 700 charioteers. This is verse 18. And once again, we're seeing that God's hand is upon David in all these victories. That it's showing that God is making his name great, right? In fulfillment of the promise he gave him in 2 Samuel 7. So, by the way, there's a parallel account of this in First Chronicles 19 that we'll encounter in a few weeks, I guess. So that's 2 Samuel 10. We'll turn over to, why don't we go over to Psalm 60 and 61. So in Psalm 60 and 61, you've got a couple of different types of psalms here. Psalm 60 is, as it says even in the title, is a lament over a defeat in battle. In other words, it's a time in which Israel had, in fact, been defeated rather than what we just saw in 2 Samuel 10, where they actually had a deliverance in battle and a victory in battle. So it's a corporate lament in that sense. And the psalmist laments this recent defeat, and he describes how he feels like God has rejected them. But in the end, he has this confidence, as with all these laments, there's the expression of confidence at the end, for deliverance by man is vain, and through God we shall do valiantly. Psalm 61, on the other hand, is a little bit of a different psalm. It is a psalm that is more focused ultimately on the king. So you'll see that it's kind of has aspects of a lament psalm, but it also has aspects of a royal psalm in that sense, since it's referencing the king. And the psalmist petitions God to hear his cry and protect him. And I love, again, some of the pictures of God here, some of the metaphors of God, that God is a rock, a refuge, a strength, a tower, and a tent even. So it talks about this idea of God being a refuge, and we've talked about that several times in our sermon series on the Psalms, and how God is this for the psalmist, and is also this for us, and that brings us confidence. Our confidence is not based in ourselves, but of course it's ultimately based on God, and what strong confidence he has, knowing, and the realization is what we see in verse 2, that God is one higher than us. In other words, we don't have the strength that he does. He has that strength, and therefore it is only fitting that we go to him for that consolation and that strength and that courage, the courage that even David talked about in 2 Samuel 10. We'll move on then we'll go over to Ezekiel. So Ezekiel here is telling a parable. It's a parable of two eagles and a vine. The vine, of course, represents Israel, or Judah in this case. And then the two eagles represent what Judah, and this is kind of telling the history really from probably the perspective of the last 11 years of Judah, from 597 BC to 586 BC before the exile. So if you remember, in that time period, that was the rule of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, the one who had his eyes gouged out, if you remember that, the one who saw Israel destroyed in the Babylonian exile of 586 BC, saw Jerusalem and the temple destroyed at that moment in time. So it's really talking about those last years. And Zedekiah was a king that was torn because he had some advisors who were telling him to trust in Babylon, or to at least not trust in them, but give in to them, and to show allegiance to them. And other advisors who were telling him to join other nations like Moab and others around them who were joining with Egypt in rebelling against the Babylonians. And so those are the two eagles, by the way. Nebuchadnezzar and is the greater of the eagles that's mentioned in this text. And the implication is that just like what Jeremiah was saying to the people over and over again, that you need to be giving into, or at least showing allegiance to the Babylonians. And then in the lesser of these eagles is, of course, the Egyptian ruler at the time. And so it's basically this parable that ultimately shows that if you go with the Egyptian ruler, if you go with the Egyptians, it's not going to go well for you. And this, of course, was a message that not just Ezekiel is proclaiming, but also something that Jeremiah proclaimed, and not necessarily a popular message, was it, for the Jewish people? They persecuted these prophets for that kind of message. But what's interesting is at the end of this parable, he speaks of a sprig from the lofty top of the cedar, and that God takes out, verse 22, plucks it from the topmost of the young twigs, a tender one, and will plant it on the high lofty mountain. That's Zion, referring to the place of God's rule. But who is this tender shoot? Well, it's very much a messianic image here. So the resolution of all the warring and the fight of these eagles is ultimately God bringing forth his Messiah. That idea of the Messiah as a tender shoot is one that we see in Isaiah as well, as a messianic image. So anyway, interesting little parable here on the part of Ezekiel. And that finally brings us to 2 Corinthians 3. So remember, in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul is making this defense of his ministry. Here he compares his ministry to that of Moses. And of course, Paul is often showing how the ministry of the Spirit, as opposed to the ministry of the law, which is represented by Moses. And of course, there were those that Paul was dealing with who believed that the law was the path of salvation. And Paul says that is not, that's only going to lead you to bondage. But instead, if you follow his ministry, which is the ministry of the Spirit, if you accept this salvation by grace through faith, through the work of the Spirit in your life, and then are led by the Spirit, you will find ultimately liberty. So that's kind of the message of Paul in this text. He talks about, for instance, also that they don't need letters of commendation at the very beginning of this chapter. Apparently, that was a common thing in the Roman world. If you were coming in an itinerant speaker, you would have letters of commendation. And Paul says, "You are our letter of commendation." That is all that we need, and we have confidence because of the work of Christ. Verse 4. And then I love the last verse 18, that we're being transformed into the same image of, speaking of Christ, from glory to glory, speaking of ultimately our destination, which is glorification, right? We're in the process of being transformed into his image. And of course, I think that has some rich Old Testament language going back to Genesis 1. The image that we are being transformed into is the image that we were originally intended to have. that image where we will ultimately be co-heirs with Christ and ruling in God's new heavens and new earth. So beautiful promise here at the end of 2 Corinthians 3 as well. So it's a good way to end and to go throughout the rest of the day, right? As meditating on how we are being transformed in the same image from glory to glory. Hope you have a great rest of the day.